Ultra-processed foods have become a defining feature of modern diets, and their long-term impact on cardiometabolic health is far more severe than many people realize. From adolescence through late adulthood, the cumulative effect of eating these highly engineered products steadily pushes the body toward diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. The danger is not simply acute spikes in blood sugar or temporary inflammation. It is the relentless, progressive wear on metabolic and cardiovascular systems that compounds over decades. When exposure begins early in life, the risks rise dramatically because the metabolic damage builds layer by layer, often without symptoms until a crisis appears. In adolescence, the consumption of ultra-processed foods begins shaping lifelong cardiometabolic vulnerability. Teens who regularly drink sugary beverages, eat fast food, and rely on packaged snacks show early signs of insulin resistance, elevated triglycerides, and higher waist circumference, even when their overall weight appears normal. Several longitudinal studies, including those published in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, show that adolescents with high ultra-processed food intake have significantly higher fasting insulin levels and impaired glucose tolerance by their early 20s. This early disruption of insulin sensitivity becomes a metabolic blueprint that tracks into adulthood, making diabetes and cardiovascular disease more likely later on. What's particularly alarming is that teenage bodies, still in development, adapt to these metabolic stresses, often masking symptoms while quietly establishing long-term dysfunction. Young adulthood adds more fuel to the fire. Studies following college-aged individuals reveal that regular consumption of ultra-processed foods, especially sugary drinks, energy-dense snacks, and processed meats, is associated with increased blood pressure, elevated LDL cholesterol, and greater visceral fat accumulation. These changes often appear before any visible weight gain, making them easy to overlook. Chronic stress, sleep disruption, and sedentary habits common in this age group further worsen the metabolic profile. Data from large cohorts, such as the CARDIS study, show that young adults who rely heavily on fast food and packaged convenience meals can develop measurable arterial stiffness and elevated inflammatory markers far earlier than expected. Even minimal metabolic impairment in one's 20s and 30s dramatically increases the risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease later in life. By this stage, ultra-processed foods are not merely contributing to unhealthy habits, they are actively reshaping the cardiovascular system in ways that accelerate aging. By middle age, the cumulative effects of decades of ultra-processed food intake become harder to hide. Adults in their 40s and 50s frequently show clear signs of metabolic damage: rising blood pressure, higher HbA1c levels, increased triglycerides, fatty liver indicators, and expanding visceral fat. Major cohort studies, such as the Nutrinet Santé trial, have found strong associations between ultra-processed food consumption and increased risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease, even after adjusting for weight, exercise, and socioeconomic factors. This indicates that the metabolic harm comes directly from the foods themselves, not just calories, but additives, emulsifiers, and refined ingredients that drive inflammation and oxidative stress. Middle-aged individuals consuming high levels of ultra-processed foods show dramatically increased rates of metabolic syndrome, a combination of risk factors that nearly doubles the risk of heart attack and stroke. The danger is compounded by the body's declining ability to compensate for metabolic insults. Insulin sensitivity falls sharply, blood vessels stiffen, and inflammation rises, meaning the same foods that a younger body might tolerate now rapidly worsen cardiometabolic health. In older adults, the risks escalate into more immediate threats. Studies show that people over 60 who consume high levels of ultra-processed foods face significantly higher rates of hypertension, atrial fibrillation, heart failure, and late-onset diabetes. Their weakened metabolic systems cannot buffer the rapid glucose spikes, sodium overload, and inflammatory triggers that accompany ultra-processed diets. The same Nutrinet Santé data shows that older adults in the highest category of ultra-processed food intake have up to a 50% increased risk of cardiovascular mortality. Sodium-heavy processed meals worsen blood pressure, refined sugars impair endothelial function, and industrial fats accelerate plaque buildup. The cumulative effect of lifelong exposure becomes brutally clear. The cardiovascular system becomes brittle, easily overwhelmed, and prone to life-threatening events. Even those who avoided earlier metabolic issues may find themselves rapidly deteriorating once age reduces their physiological resilience. Across all ages, the consistent message from scientific research is that ultra-processed foods sharply increase cardiometabolic risk, independent of weight, genetics, or activity level. The risks compound quietly and relentlessly. Early insulin resistance transitions into chronic inflammation, mild blood pressure elevations become full hypertension, small cholesterol shifts become arterial plaque. These are not isolated issues. They form a self-reinforcing chain that leads directly to diabetes, heart attack, stroke, and premature death. The warning is unavoidable. The long-term consumption of ultra-processed foods creates a predictable and escalating trajectory of cardiometabolic decline from adolescence to older adulthood. What begins as subtle metabolic stress in youth becomes a driving force of chronic disease in middle age and a potentially fatal threat in later life. Without decisive dietary change, each stage of life inherits the damage of the one before it, making ultra-processed foods one of the most potent, silent accelerators of cardiometabolic disease in the modern world.